Why life gets better after 40. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the psyche has a morning and an afternoon, and that most of the suffering he saw in the second half of life came from people still dressed for the morning long after the sun had moved. Here is the premise, and I want you to sit with it before we go further. Jung wrote in a 1930 essay called The Stages of Life, in Collected Works Volume 8, paragraph 784, that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. That is the whole quote. And Jung would stop you right there and say, do you see it? You are not falling apart after 40. You are simply still running a program that was written for a much younger person. The ambition, the proving, the building of a name, all of it correct for the morning, all of it now, at this later hour, quietly obsolete, and the ache you feel is not decline, it is the psyche asking for a new instruction. So let me say a few words for you. Plainly, first person, present tense, I have been running an old program, and I did not know it had an expiration. I am willing to let the second half of my life ask something different of me. And I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I have been running an old program, and I did not know it had an expiration. I am willing to let the second half of my life ask something different of me. And I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I have been running an old program, and I did not know it had an expiration. I am willing to let the second half of my life ask something different of me. And I make the unconscious conscious. And if you would like tomorrow's teaching to find you the way this one did, consider staying close by subscribing, quietly, so the next fire we sit at together is easy to find. Now before the keys, type the 2 words "face it" in the comments. Just those 2 words. If something in you went a little quiet just now hearing that quote, let those 2 words be your seal on it. The first key is that 40 is not a wall. It is a border crossing, and nobody warns you that you need a new passport. In the morning of life, the tasks are mostly the same for everyone. Establish yourself, find a partner, build a place in the world, earn your seat at the table. And Jung called this the necessary and even noble work of the first half. He never mocked it. He never told the young man to skip his ambition. But he noticed something almost nobody else in his profession was noticing in the early 1900s, that the patients filling his consulting room past the middle of life were not struggling with old problems, they were struggling with problems that had no name yet. Because the second half of life is not a longer version of the first, it is a different country with its own weather, its own customs, its own quiet rules that nobody printed in a manual. Think of a woman who spends her whole 30s proving she can carry any load without complaint. She gets the promotion. She keeps the house running. She is the one everyone calls when something breaks. And then one ordinary Tuesday in her 42nd year, folding laundry that has been folded 1,000 times before, she is suddenly and inexplicably close to tears. Nothing happened that day, no crisis, no bad news, only the small domestic ritual she has performed for 2 decades. And yet something in her, quietly and without asking permission, has stopped agreeing to the arrangement. That is the border crossing, arriving not with fanfare, but in the middle of laundry. Imagine a man who did everything asked of him, built the career, raised the family, kept every appointment with duty, and at 44, he sits in his own car, in his own driveway, and cannot make himself go inside. Not because anything is wrong, but because nothing means what it used to mean. That is not a crisis invented by a magazine. That is the psyche telling him the morning program has expired. The old customs papers are no longer valid on this side of the border. And here is the quiet mercy in it. This is not punishment. It is an invitation. The very disorientation is proof that something in you is still alive enough to want more than repetition. A program that has expired is not a life that has failed. It is only a season that has finished its work. And the discomfort you feel crossing over is simply what it costs to leave a country you knew well, for one you have not yet learned to read. I stop pretending the crossing has not begun. The second key is that the word Jung used for this whole process was individuation. and he defined it plainly in Collected Works Volume 7, paragraph 266, as coming to selfhood. Notice what that phrase does not say. It does not say arriving at happiness. It does not say achieving success. It means becoming the specific, whole, undivided person you actually are, beneath the roles you took on to survive your younger years. And the word individual quietly does the work here. An individual is a thing that cannot be divided any further. Not the job title, not the parent role, not the reputation, but the whole of you, contradictions included. And here is what nobody tells you about the crossing at 40. The reason it can feel like falling apart is that you are actually being gathered back together. The persona that served you so well in the morning, the mask of the reliable one, the strong one, was never meant to be the whole of you. It was scaffolding. And scaffolding is supposed to come down once the building can stand on its own. Imagine a woman known for 30 years at her office as the one who never rattles, the one colleagues bring their panic to because she always has a calm answer, and one ordinary Tuesday she feels an exhaustion sleep cannot touch. Because it is not her body that is tired, it is the mask that is tired, carrying a weight her actual self was never consulted about, and by Thursday, she notices she resents the very praise that once fueled her. Being called so capable now lands like a small cage closing tighter. This is not ingratitude, this is the self. With a capital letter, Jung used deliberately. Knocking from inside a house it helped build but was never invited past. Now imagine the same pattern in a different coat. A man known for 25 years as the fixer, who learned early that steadiness earned respect and softness earned nothing. And at 46, he sits through an ordinary family dinner and finds his throat tightening for no reason he can name. And later, alone, realizes he cannot remember the last time he told anyone what he actually wanted, only what he could handle. That quiet realization is the same knocking, the same self asking for its share of a life it helped build, but was never allowed to enter. Pause for a moment and pick one real mask you have worn longer than it has been true. The calm one, the strong one, the one who never needs anything. And ask honestly whether it still fits the person underneath, or whether it has simply become a habit nobody has questioned in years. Jung was careful to say, the persona itself is not the enemy. Every psyche needs some negotiated face to meet the world with. The danger is only in mistaking the mask for the man, forgetting there was ever a face underneath it at all. So when the mask starts to feel heavy in your 40s, when a role you were once proud of starts to feel like a costume 2 sizes too small, that is not you unraveling. That is the beginning of being gathered. I let the scaffolding come down, without calling it collapse. The third key is the unlived life. And this is the part of the teaching that explains why so many people who seem, by every outward measure, to have succeeded, feel the worst pull of all after 40. Because success in the morning is measured by the world's yardstick, and the world's yardstick only measures what is visible: the career climbed, the house bought, the family raised. But every one of those achievements was built by choosing, and every choice is also a small closing of a door, the path not taken into art, the calling toward solitude that got traded for security, the tenderness that got traded for toughness because toughness paid better. None of it wrong, all of it necessary in its season. But Jung noticed that whatever gets set aside in the morning does not simply vanish. It goes underground, into what he called the unconscious, and it waits, patiently, the way water waits behind a dam, and somewhere around the middle of life it starts to press. Quietly at first, as restlessness, as envy of people living differently, as dreams that keep returning to an old, abandoned direction, and then less quietly, as the flatness that makes an entire well-built life feel like a house with a floor nobody has switched the lights on in for 20 years. Think of it this way for a moment. Every life is a kind of ledger, and every choice you made in your 20s and 30s was a withdrawal from one account to make a deposit into another. You took from the account marked adventure to fund the account marked stability. You took from the account marked solitude to fund the account marked belonging. And the world only ever hands you a statement for the account you funded. It never shows you the one you drained. So a person can stand at 45 holding what looks, on paper, like a fortune, and still feel quietly bankrupt, because the statement they are actually feeling is the one nobody prints, the one for everything that was withdrawn and never spoken of again. Jung recalled his own collapse at 38 in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The outward achievement was considerable by then. Publications, a growing reputation, a full household, and still something in him gave way, and it was only by turning toward what had been set aside, not away from it, that the second half of his life became, by his own account, the richer half. Imagine a businessman Jung described in his writing on the stages of life. A man who had built an empire of commerce, and then, past 50, found himself unable to summon interest in the empire at all, not from exhaustion, but from a kind of homesickness for a part of himself the empire had required him to leave behind. And now imagine a smaller, quieter version of the very same pattern, a woman in her 40s, comfortable, respected, who finds herself standing in the kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday evening, dinner already planned, work already handled, and she is suddenly, for no reason she can name, near tears over an old photograph of herself at 22, holding a paintbrush she has not held since. Nothing is wrong that week, nothing dramatic has happened, and that is exactly the point. The unlived life rarely announces itself through catastrophe. It prefers the small, unguarded moment, the drive home in silence, the song from decades ago on the radio, the empty house on a Sunday afternoon. This is the pattern to watch for in your own week. Pause for a moment and notice, is there an old interest that keeps tapping at the window of your attention? A hobby you loved before it stopped being practical? A way of thinking or making or being with people that you quietly filed away as impractical 20 years ago? That tap is not nostalgia, and it is not weakness. It is the unlived life asking to be let back into the house. And here is the deeper truth underneath it. The unlived life is not asking you to abandon what you built. It rarely wants you to quit the job or leave the family. It usually only wants a room, an hour, a corner of the week where it can finally breathe. The afternoon of life is exactly the season for turning around and finally letting it in, not as a replacement for what you built, but as the missing half that makes the whole house livable again. I stop calling my set-aside self impractical and start calling it unfinished. The fourth key is that this whole turn has a significance of its own. That phrase comes from the same essay. Jung insisted that the afternoon of life is not a lesser copy of the morning, not a slow fade of the same values at lower volume, but has a significance of its own. And I want to be careful here, because this is where people race ahead into vague comfort, thinking that older simply equals wiser. Jung never said that. Plenty of people reach 60 and 70, still running the exact same morning program, still measuring themselves by the same scoreboard, still performing the same persona, only now with less energy for the performance. And that is not individuation. That is exhaustion wearing the costume of age. Imagine a woman of 55 who spent 30 years being the one everyone could count on, the first to arrive at the office, the one who remembered every birthday, the one whose worth was proven daily by how much she could carry for other people. And now her children are grown, and her role at work has quietly become ceremonial, and she keeps volunteering for the same exhausting tasks, not because anyone still needs her to, but because stopping feels like disappearing. That is the morning scoreboard still running long after the game that mattered has ended. And it is worth noticing how ordinary this looks from the outside. Nobody would call her unwell. She simply looks tired, a little flat, a little too busy for someone whose busyness no longer produces anything she can name. The significance Jung meant has to be earned by attention, by actually noticing the shift and cooperating with it, rather than gripping harder onto the morning's goals out of fear that letting go means becoming nobody. Here is the diagnostic mirror for this one. Think back over an ordinary recent day, the errands, the meetings, the small performances of competence you gave to people who barely noticed them, and ask honestly, how much of that day was lived from genuine interest, and how much was lived from the old script that says, I must still be useful in exactly the way I was useful at 30. If the honest answer is mostly the old script, that is not a failure to report. It is simply the information you needed. Notice too that the significance of the afternoon rarely announces itself with fanfare. It tends to arrive in small refusals. The meeting you no longer want to lead, the small talk you no longer want to perform, the achievement that once would have thrilled you and now barely registers. These are not signs of falling behind. They are the psyche quietly withdrawing its investment from a stage that has already been paid in full. The afternoon is not asking you to stop contributing. It is asking you to contribute from a different route, from meaning rather than proving, from what actually interests you now rather than what once impressed someone else. I let the second half be judged by its own measure, not the morning's. The fifth key is the deepest one, and I want to walk it in several pieces, because it took Jung himself the hardest years of his own life to arrive at it fully. First, consider what actually breaks in a person at midlife. It is rarely the outer circumstance itself, the divorce, or the layoff, or the diagnosis. Those are only the events. But underneath the event is almost always the same discovery, that the self built for the morning was partial, was one-sided, was, in Jung's own phrase, an artificial personality, useful and even necessary for its season, but never the whole truth of the person wearing it. And when that partial self meets a demand it cannot meet, something in the unconscious that was excluded from the morning's construction rises up to claim its share. This is not bad luck. It is closer to a law of the psyche, as steady as gravity. Second, consider why this rising so often feels less like a gift and more like a demotion, because the qualities excluded from the morning persona are usually the ones convention frowned upon. The softness in a man who built his identity on strength, the ambition in a woman who built hers on service, the need for solitude in someone who built theirs on endless availability. And when these excluded qualities surface after 40, they arrive with the accumulated force of decades of waiting quietly in the dark, which is why grief, or sudden anger, or a hunger for a different life, can feel less like growth and more like betrayal of everyone who relied on the old version of you. Third, and here is where Jung's teaching turns oddly comforting, he insisted this disruption is not the psyche turning against you. It is the psyche insisting on completeness rather than mere adequacy. Adequacy is the morning's whole ambition, to be adequate to the role, the expectation, the scoreboard everyone else is watching. But completeness asks a harder question. Not whether you performed the role well, but whether the role ever contained the whole of you in the first place. And it rarely did, because no single role, however well built, can hold an entire human being. Imagine a schoolteacher who spent 30 years being the calm one, the dependable one, never raising her voice, never asking for help herself, and then, at 51, she finds herself weeping in the staff room over a spilled cup of coffee, not because of the coffee, but because something in her that was never allowed to need anything has finally found a small enough excuse to break through. That is not a woman falling apart. That is a woman meeting the part of herself the morning required her to leave standing outside in the cold. Fourth, consider the retired businessman Jung wrote of in Collected Works, Volume 7, a man who had organized his whole worth around his role in the firm, who had become identical with his own job title, and who, upon retirement, found no self left standing once the persona was removed like a coat. This is the danger of the crossing done badly. Not that the old program expires. All programs expire in their season, but that a person refuses to notice the expiration, keeps polishing an identity the actual hour of life no longer requires, and the emptiness that follows is proof that something essential is still waiting, unbuilt, beneath the rubble of the old role. Imagine, too, a father known for 30 years as the fixer, who never let anyone see him afraid, and now stands in a garage full of tools with no task left for them, turning a wrench over in his hands. And the grief in him has nothing to do with the tools. It has to do with a self only ever allowed to exist as useful, now being asked for the first time what it might be simply as itself. Fifth, walk with me through an ordinary week, the way this shows up quietly. Monday brings a low static of irritation at work you once loved without question. By Wednesday, you are short with someone you care about over something too small to explain afterward. By Friday, you stare at a full calendar, feeling almost nothing you can name. By Saturday, you stand at an open refrigerator, having forgotten what you came for. And that evening, alone for an hour, an old memory surfaces uninvited, something from before the morning program took hold. That hour is the fifth key working in the actual texture of an actual week, the same pattern repeating in smaller currency, the sigh you did not mean to let out in a meeting, the extra minute lingered in the car, the old song that moves you for no reason you can point to. Sixth, understand the unconscious does not argue in clear, reasonable sentences. It argues in moods, in unexplained fatigue, in sudden tears over nothing, in the dream that keeps recurring however many times you dismiss it. And the task set before every person crossing this threshold is not to silence these signals, but to take them as seriously as a message from someone you deeply respect. Because that is exactly what they are, the part of you left standing outside the morning's narrow door, finally getting its turn to speak after decades of patient waiting. Seventh, and this is worth saying plainly because it is so often misheard, none of this means the strength you built was false. The calm teacher's steadiness was real. The fixing father's devotion was real. The businessman's competence was real. The excluded half does not arrive to cancel what you built. It arrives to complete it, to sit down at the same table rather than replace the one already seated there. And the good news, if it can be called that, is that this speaking is not an ending. It is the actual beginning of the deeper self Jung called individuation. The slow gathering of everything you were once forced to leave outside the morning's door, back into one undivided life. I let what was excluded from my morning speak, and I listen without punishing it for arriving late. The sixth key is the gentlest one, and it is simply this, that the whole of this teaching was never meant to frighten you about growing older. It was meant to relieve you of a burden you may not have known you were carrying. The burden of believing that if life feels different after 40, something has gone wrong with you specifically, and I want to sit with you in that relief for a moment before we close, because so many people carry this ache in secret, quietly assuming they are the only one who built a whole life and then, one ordinary evening, felt strangely unmoved by it. Imagine a woman who spent 20 years raising a family with real devotion, who kept every birthday remembered, and every meal made, and who now, with the house grown quiet, finds herself standing in the kitchen at 6 in the evening, not knowing what to do with her own hands. She is not failing at rest. She is meeting the same threshold Jung described, the psyche asking for a new instruction now that the old one has been faithfully completed. And here is what I want you to notice. Nothing in her needed fixing. The discomfort itself was the sign of health, not the sign of something broken. A psyche that could sit forever in the old program without complaint would be the more worrying case, not the one that finally speaks up. Jung would want you to know that the difference you feel after 40 is not a malfunction. It is the psyche's own architecture, built with a morning and an afternoon on purpose. The way a day itself is built that way, without anyone calling noon a crisis. The fact that the afternoon asks something new of you is not evidence of decline, but evidence that you are still, at this very hour, capable of a kind of growth the younger version of you could not yet have managed, could not yet have earned. The morning teaches you to build a life. The afternoon teaches you to inhabit it honestly, to stop performing it, and start actually living inside it. And that second task, quieter, less applauded, without an audience clapping for it, the way they clapped for the promotions and the milestones, is in its own way the harder and finer one. So if you are sitting with this today, feeling the exact ache the title of this teaching named, know that the ache is not proof that life is over. It is proof that life still has something further to ask of you, something it could not have asked of you before now, and that you are still someone capable of answering, capable of turning toward the question rather than away from it. I meet the afternoon of my life on its own honest terms. Here is the whole picture. 40 is not a wall, it is a border crossing. Coming to selfhood means gathering the whole of you, not performing a role. The unlived life waits patiently and then presses to be let in. The afternoon of life has a significance entirely its own. What was excluded from your morning is not your enemy, but your unfinished half asking to be heard. And none of this is decline dressed up in kinder language. It is the psyche's own quiet architecture, doing exactly what it was built to do. These 6 were never 6 separate teachings. They were 6 turns of one single key. And that key is simply this: that you were never meant to keep living the morning's program forever. You were always meant, one day, to close that book gently and open the next one. So let this be your closing thought. Not a slogan, not a decoration, but a real question to carry with you past this fire tonight. If the morning of your life taught you how to build, what might the afternoon be quietly waiting to teach you about how to finally live? I have been running an old program, and I did not know it had an expiration. I am willing to let the second half of my life ask something different of me, and I make the unconscious conscious. And if life feels like it is asking something new of you lately, perhaps that is not the ending you feared, but the better half. Finally, gently,